Hi and welcome to the Core Finance Master Investor Show. My name's James Faulkner, I'm the editorial director of Master Investor magazine and I'm joined as usual by Victor Hill.
Good afternoon, James.
Hi Victor. You've been writing about the African markets lately.
That's correct.
And since the publication of your piece in the last issue of the magazine, we've had President Jacob Zuma, who's been overthrown, shall we say, in South Africa.
Well, let's say squeezed out. Yeah.
What does this mean for the investment landscape in South Africa and the wider African markets?
Well, I think this exemplifies a very positive trend, which is that the old school of African leader who validated their power by virtue of their association with liberation struggles of one kind or another are on their way out, and there's a new generation of leaders coming in who are conscious of some of the failings of the old guard. And in particular, there's the issue of corruption. Now, Ramaphosa, of course, is in fact very much a member of the South African political establishment. He's been around a very long time. But in a way, 65 years old, he can be seen as a new broom. And he started off in very good fettle with an excellent speech which buoyed the markets. He wants to clean the place up and he wants to sweep away the old regime, the bad management in public sector companies, and to reform the country in terms of fiscal reform and structural reforms to the economy. So I think the market reaction, which was extremely positive, the Johannesburg market was up 5%. I think that's very justified. There's an optimistic mood. And I think we shall see more good news coming out of South Africa over the course of this year.
Okay. You mentioned 4 long-term trends in your piece that bode well for Africa economically.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on those a little bit?
Well, that's right. And this is something that's been going on for some time. First of all, we have a trend towards robust and sustained economic growth right across the continent, albeit with some laggards and some very unfortunate countries which are still unfortunately in civil strife, and we can talk about Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, Somalia and others which are almost failed states, as indeed is Libya right now. But the outlook overall is very good economically speaking. The African Development Bank predicts that the African economy overall will grow by 4.1% this year, up from about 3.7% last year. And indeed, Africa boasted last year some of the fastest growing economies in the world, of which Ethiopia with growth of more than 8%, Djibouti 7.5%, admittedly from a very low base, Tanzania going places with growth of over 7%. So there's some powerful growth going on. 4% around the sort of mean for countries like Kenya. Even Egypt is exhibiting some signs of economic growth after a laggardly performance further to the Arab Spring.
And how does the positive economic outlook feed into the investment outlook?
Well, I think the markets have responded accordingly. 2016 was a pretty poor year for African markets overall, against a backdrop of falling oil prices and falling commodity prices. That trend reversed in the second half of 2017, and we saw some pretty remarkable stock market gains of the leading African markets, of which Johannesburg, Nairobi, Ghana and Malawi and others. We saw in dollar terms growth of around the 30% mark. And there is a real possibility that double-digit trend will be sustained over 2018, and already, in fact, we've seen some remarkable performances from the Abidjan market, up 30% in dollar terms. That's Ghana, and also from South Africa and from Nairobi, which is up 7%.
And which African markets in particular have caught your eye for investors going forward?
Well, I pinpointed 4 markets which impress me, and they impress me because overall, with some qualifications, they are politically stable, and as has been exhibited in South Africa, the transition was effected peacefully. And they have huge potential, and they are already attracting investment, and infrastructure is rapidly increasing, not least with Chinese capital involved. And those four markets that I illuminated were Ghana, Nigeria, South Africa and Kenya. So all very much in the Anglosphere, the Anglophone part of Africa.
And how can private investors gain access to the African markets, especially given that they are still very risky for investors?
Well, let's be clear, the main risk historically has been in terms of political risk, where there's regime change, which spooks the market, but also in particular in terms of currency risk, where you put your dollars or pounds or euros into these markets and you find that the currency rapidly devalues. But if you look at the top performing African markets, we're seeing a much higher degree of currency stability. So, for example, I pointed out that the Kenyan shilling has remained stable against the US dollar for more or less 2 years now. And this is partly a function of rising commodity prices, which itself is a function of the falling dollar. So political risk, currency risk. There's also, of course, the risk in terms of governance and management at the individual company level, which is why I think you're better off going with a mixed fund which allocates across different industrial sectors, and even one which allocates across specific countries, selected African countries.
Okay.
And I outlined a couple of those funds in the piece. And
for the more adventurous investors, are there any particular companies that you think might be worth getting exposure to?
Yes, I wouldn't go for the more exotic companies, but look at companies which have an established track record like Safaricom in Kenya, and some of the South African miners which are going places and which will definitely benefit from rising commodity prices going forward.
What are you writing about next month, Victor?
Well, for March issue of Master Investor magazine, I'm going to be looking at new trends in oil exploration, new technology, which is going to make a huge impact in that sector. And I shall have a look at the very controversial field of fracking. And I inquire as to where that might be heading right now. Right,
we'll keep an eye out for that one. That's all we've got time for today. You can read the entire magazine at masterinvestor.co.uk. Thanks for watching. I'll be back next month.
Thanks, James.